The groom hit the floor before anyone even realized that something had gone terribly wrong. A moment earlier, he had been laughing, a glass of champagne held halfway to his lips as the string quartet drifted softly through the hall. In the next heartbeat, his body simply folded in on itself like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly severed. The glass shattered against the polished marble. A woman let out a sharp, shrill scream, and chairs scraped harshly across the floor as the crowd reacted. Someone shouted his name over and over again, as if the sheer repetition of his identity could pull him back from wherever he had just vanished to. I was standing 10 feet away, clutching a tray I had no memory of picking up. For a frozen second, no one moved. Then, the collective panic took hold. People rushed in, crowding around him, kneeling and hovering, their voices tangling together in a chaotic web of alarm. Someone tried to lift his shoulders. Someone else fumbled with their phone, frantically calling for help but unable to articulate anything useful. I saw his face turn a sickly gray, his lips already tinged with blue, and something buried deep inside me shifted, an instinct I hadn't visited in years. I stepped forward. Back off. You're just a dishwasher. The words hit with enough force to stop me for half a heartbeat. I didn't bother looking up to see who had spoken. I didn't need to. I had heard variations of that sentence before, different words, same underlying meaning. Asterisk not qualified. Not wanted. Not anymore. They weren't wrong. But his breathing was. I set the tray down somewhere, I think, and dropped to my knees beside him. Move, I said quietly. My voice wasn't loud, nor was it particularly commanding, it was simply certain. No one listened at first, not until I reached for his jaw and tilted his head back, checking his airway with fingers that possessed a muscle memory far deeper than I ever allowed myself to acknowledge. Then, a voice from behind me sliced through the noise. Give her space. It wasn't a loud voice either, but it carried an undeniable weight. People shifted reluctantly, just enough to clear a path. I pressed 2 fingers firmly to his neck. His pulse was irregular and weak. Call 911 again, I ordered. Tell them he's not breathing properly. I already did. Someone snapped back. Then stay on the line, I replied, already leaning closer to listen to his chest. The rhythm wasn't just off, it was collapsing in on itself. I could feel the instability even without the monitors, the machines, or the sterile, clinical brightness of an operating room to guide me. For a fleeting moment, I hesitated. I wasn't supposed to do this anymore. The last time I had, it had cost me absolutely everything. Are you even trained for this? Another voice demanded. I ignored it. I adjusted his position, cleared his airway, and began to count under my breath. 1, 2, 3. A memory flashed, uninvited, bright, harsh lights, the steady, rhythmic beep of a monitor, and a younger version of myself standing over a table, my hands steady and my voice calm. I shoved the memory away. This wasn't then. This was now. I pressed down on his chest. Hey, stop, I said, looking up briefly. Back off. Unless one of you knows exactly what you're doing. No one answered. I continued. Compression, breath, compression. The room had grown quieter, though I hadn't noticed exactly when the shift occurred. The panic had thinned into something else, perhaps fear, or perhaps the heavy stillness of waiting. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Oh my God, it's her. I looked up. He was standing just beyond the circle, tall even as age began to settle into the line of his shoulders. His suit was dark and formal, the kind worn by men who had spent a lifetime accustomed to being obeyed. But it wasn't the suit that caught my attention, it was his face. There was no fear there, only recognition and something deeper, something akin to disbelief. Our eyes met for half a second. It was long enough. I looked back down at the groom. Stay with me, I muttered, though I didn't know if he could hear it. I adjusted my hands, recalibrating the pressure. The rhythm under my palms shifted slightly. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The ambulance is 2 minutes out, someone called. Good. I kept going. 1, 2, 3. The general stepped closer, his voice low, meant only for me. I thought. He didn't finish his sentence. Neither did I. There wasn't time. After what felt like an eternity, I finally felt it, a change. It was subtle and fragile, but it was there. I paused just long enough to verify the pulse. It was faint, but present. "Okay," I said quietly. "Okay." The room seemed to breathe again in unison with me. Sirens cut through the distance, growing louder by the second. I sat back slightly, not fully letting go, just providing enough space for the paramedics as they rushed in, their movements sharp, efficient, and well-practiced. I answered their questions without having to think, the timing, the symptoms, the sequence of what I had done. They didn't ask who I was. That part didn't matter. Not anymore. As they lifted him onto the stretcher and wheeled him out, the crowd parted in a heavy, echoing silence. The celebration had been drained out of the room, replaced by something far more somber. I stayed on my knees for a second longer than I strictly needed to. When I finally stood, I realized my hands were trembling. I hadn't noticed until that very moment. I walked back toward the service corridor without looking at anyone, wiping my palms on my apron, an act of habit more than anything else. "Wait." His voice stopped me in my tracks. I turned. The general was closer now, close enough that I could see the fine, intricate lines around his eyes and the way time had settled into his features without softening the underlying steel. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment, then slowly shook my head. It wasn't entirely true, but it was significantly easier. He studied me as if he were weighing a heavy secret. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "I remember you," he said. I didn't answer. What could I possibly have said? I turned away and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. The sudden onslaught of noise hit me all at once. The rush of water, the clattering of dishes, and voices overlapping in confused speculation. Someone asked what had happened. Someone else whispered that they heard the groom had died. I moved to the sink and turned on the faucet. The hot water rushed over my hands, and I stood there for a long time, just letting it flow. No one asked me anything. Martha glanced at me once from across the room, her expression unreadable, before returning to her duties. That was the one thing I had always appreciated about her. She didn't ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. I picked up a plate and started scrubbing. It was the same as before. Same as always. But my hands didn't quite feel the same. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a door I had kept bolted shut for years had opened, just a crack. I didn't know if I was prepared for what might come through it, but I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I couldn't close it again. "You don't," I replied. "I do." "You don't," I repeated, my tone firming. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then let me ask you this," he said. "If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently?" The question landed with more weight than any of the others. It wasn't that I hadn't wrestled with that query 1,000 times before, because I had. Every single day. I didn't answer right away. When I finally did, my voice remained steady. "No," I said. He nodded once. He wasn't surprised, but he wasn't relieved either. He simply accepted it. "I thought so," he said. Then he stepped back. "Good night," he added. "Good night," I replied. I watched him climb into his car and pull away, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I stood there for a long time afterward, letting the cool night air settle around me, the chaotic noise of the day finally fading into the silence. For years, I had convinced myself that what happened back then was over, closed, buried, and forgotten. But standing in that empty lot, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. It hadn't been buried at all. It had been waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't what he had said that kept me awake, but what I had said. "If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently?" No. The word had come out steady, certain. But I knew that certainty and peace were not the same thing. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator in the next room, replaying the question over and over, turning it inside out. Each time, the answer remained the same. And each time, it felt heavier. The next morning, I didn't head straight to work. Instead, I drove. At first, I only meant to go a short distance, but I found myself driving past my usual turn, moving further out of town. The landscape opened up as the residential streets gave way to flat plains and older, weathered buildings, places that had barely changed in decades. I didn't need a map. My hands knew the way. The VA hospital slowly rose into view, maintaining the same quiet, imposing presence it had held for years. The brickwork looked a little more worn, and the parking lot seemed fuller, but otherwise, it was identical to how I remembered it. I parked across the street and sat there, hesitant. It had been years since I had been back, years since I had dared to even drive past this entrance. From my seat, I watched the automatic doors sliding open and shut as people filtered in and out, nurses in scrubs, families clutching overnight bags, and veterans walking with a deliberate, painful slowness. Life was carrying on, completely unaffected by my presence. Or so it appeared. Finally, I opened the door and stepped out. The air was sharper than I expected. I crossed the street, each step feeling heavy measured. Inside, the scent hit me immediately, the familiar, clinical mix of antiseptic, stale coffee, and a faint metallic tang. The lobby had been renovated with new chairs and updated signage, but the atmosphere remained unchanged, controlled, quiet, and deeply purposeful. No one stopped me, no one recognized me. I had counted on that. I walked down the main hallway, passing departments I used to navigate without a second thought. Radiology, cardiology, the ICU wing. I didn't go all the way to the ICU. Not yet. Instead, I turned into a smaller, neglected corridor leading to the administrative offices. That was where it had all started. I stopped before the door to the old conference room. It used to be propped open constantly, a hub for urgent meetings, case reviews, and split-second decisions. Now, it was shut. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood, before pushing it open. The room was empty. A long table, a few mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard still bearing half-erased notes that had lost all meaning. But I could see it, not as the room was now, but as it had been that night. I could see the people sitting where there was now only dust, hear the voices overlapping, and feel the tension thick enough to choke on. 2 charts on the table. 2 lives. 1 decision. We don't have enough resources. That had been the first thing said out loud. Not a question, but a cold, hard fact. Or 3 is still occupied, someone else had added. And the ICU is at capacity. We can transfer. No time, I had countered. The conversation had shifted, becoming faster, sharper. Which patient has better odds? That question. It was always that question. On paper, it was Daniel. He was younger, stronger, and had fewer underlying conditions. The other man, Earl Patterson, I remembered his name now, was not expected to survive aggressive intervention. Not with his history. Not with how far his condition had progressed. But there was something about him. Not in the medical charts, but in the man himself. The way he had looked at me when I first walked in, not with fear or confusion, but with a strange, quiet presence. As if he understood something the rest of us were still frantically trying to calculate. Make the call. I turned. A man was standing in the doorway. He wasn't in uniform that night, just a sharp suit, but his posture gave him away. He was the same man who had stood outside the operating room later, the general. At the time, I didn't know who he was, only that he was more than just family. He stepped into the room, his presence shifting the balance of the air in the space. My son, he said, he's in the other room. Daniel. That was the first time I had heard his name. He's stable for now, I replied, but he won't be if we delay. And the other patient? He asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew it all too well. He's critical, I said. Multiple complications. Which one has a chance? He pressed. There it was again. Not which one deserved it. Not which one needed it more. Just, asterisk, which one has a chance? Asterisk, I looked at the 2 charts, then back at him. If it were your son, he said quietly, what would you do? That question had followed me longer than any other. Not because it was unfair, it was, in fact, painfully human, but because that humanity was what made the decision so agonizing. Back in the present, I sat down in one of the chairs, the weight of the memory settling over me like a burden I had never truly put down. I hadn't answered him that night. Not in words. But I had answered him with my hands. With the decision I made next. A soft knock pulled me back to the present. I looked up to see a woman in the doorway, a nurse in her mid-40s, looking at me with professional curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. I stood up. "No," I said, "I was just passing through." She offered me a polite, fleeting smile, the kind reserved for strangers who clearly didn't belong but weren't causing any trouble. "All right," she said. "Just let me know if you need anything." "Thank you." I left the room without looking back, but the past didn't stay behind. It followed me down the hallway, through the lobby, and out into the biting cold air. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I drove to a place I had avoided for even longer, a small cemetery on the edge of town. There were no gates or guards, just rows of weathered stones and a winding gravel path. I parked and walked in, needing no help to find the spot. I had been there once before, years ago, early in the morning, before anyone else arrived. I had stood exactly where I stood now, looking at the name carved into the granite, * Earl Patterson. Below it, the dates. A life reduced to a few numbers. "I'm sorry," I had whispered then. The words had felt hollow, inadequate. They didn't change a thing. "I wondered if you'd come back." I turned. He was standing a few yards away. The general. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture as rigid as ever. "You followed me?" I asked. "No," he said. "I just know where this road leads." I looked back at the headstone. "You knew him," I said. "Yes. Family." He shook his head, then added a number. I waited for him to continue, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he stepped closer and stopped beside me. "He saved my life once," he said finally. The words sank in slowly. This wasn't what I had expected. I glanced at him. "He was a mechanic," I said. "Yes. And he saved my life." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "In ways that don't show up in medical reports," he added. I looked back at the stone. Something shifted in my mind, not the facts of what happened, but how they connected. "He didn't have a chance," I said quietly. The general was silent for a moment. Then, looking at me, he said, "He had you." I let out a shaky, slow breath. "That wasn't enough," I replied. "No," he agreed. We stood there in silence, two people bound to the same traumatic moment for entirely different reasons. "I told them it was my decision," I said after a while. His head turned slightly. "What?" "The hospital," I clarified. "The report." I said I made the call alone. "You didn't," he said. "I did," I insisted. "That's not what I meant." I looked at him, then back at the stone. "I know," I said. Another pause stretched between us, longer this time. "They needed someone to blame," I continued, "and I was already there." "You didn't have to accept it," he said. I shook my head. "Yes," I said, "I did." He didn't argue. "Not this time." "What are you going to do now?" he asked. The question felt different from the others. It was less about the past and more about the future. I thought about my kitchen, the sink, the quiet, small life I had painstakingly built out of nothing. "I don't know," I said honestly. He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "There's something you should know." I paused and looked back. "The man who died," he said, "Earl. He made a request before he lost consciousness." My chest tightened. "What kind of request?" I asked. The general held my gaze. "He asked us not to let anyone else pay for it." The words landed softly, yet they felt heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't respond, I didn't trust my voice, so I simply nodded once and walked away. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the drawer I had kept locked shut. Inside lay the letter, the one I had never answered, the one that had arrived weeks after everything fell apart. I held it for a long time before slowly unfolding it. The envelope had yellowed at the edges. I had moved 3 times since it arrived, and yet, somehow, it had followed me, tucked into shoe boxes, slipped between folded papers, buried under things I claimed mattered more. But the truth was that I always knew exactly where it was. The handwriting on the front was careful, not elegant, but deliberate, as if every stroke had required immense effort. My name was written without a title. No doctor, no inmate number. Just my name. I sat at my kitchen table, the lamp dimmed, the rest of the apartment swallowed by shadow. Outside, a truck passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the wall before vanishing. For a long time, I just held the letter. Then I unfolded it. There wasn't much inside. A single page, a few short lines. I had read them once years ago and folded them back up so quickly that the paper nearly tore. This time, I forced myself to read slowly. Earl Patterson had written the letter before his final surgery, or perhaps asked someone else to write it for him. The words were plain and simple, devoid of any grandiloquence. He wrote that he knew his chances were poor. He wrote that he understood doctors had to make choices that regular people would never comprehend. And then, he wrote the thing I had spent years trying to forget. Asterisk, if it comes down to me or somebody younger, don't let them waste it on an old man who's already had his turn. I set the letter down. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I pressed my hands flat against the wood of the table, as if the physical weight might steady my nerves. For years, I had told myself I accepted the blame because I made the decision, and the outcome was mine to bear. Because no matter what anyone said, Earl Patterson had died after I chose against the math, against the policy, and against the safer version of the truth. But that letter complicated everything. It always had. That was why I kept it hidden. Not because it accused me, but because it forgave me. And forgiveness, when you don't feel you deserve it, can feel much harsher than judgment. The next morning, Martha found me standing behind the restaurant before sunrise. I was nearly an hour early. The alley still smelled of lingering rain and damp cardboard. A delivery truck had left muddy tracks near the back door, and the trash bins were rattling in the wind. "You sleep here now?" she asked. I turned. She was carrying 2 coffees. She handed me one before I could refuse. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "That makes 2 of us." We stood there for a while, sipping coffee in the pale, gray light. Martha owned the catering company with the stubborn pride of someone who had survived too many lean months to be easily impressed by a few good ones. Her husband had started the business 30 years ago as a sandwich counter. After he passed away, people assumed she would sell, but she hadn't. She kept the place running through rising rents, broken ovens, late invoices, and brides who wanted a 5-course meal on a soup and salad budget. She had hired me without asking questions, a rarity in this world. I owed her more than I had ever expressed. "Hospital called," she said finally. My hand tightened around the paper cup. "They called here?" "No, they called me because the groom's family asked where you worked. I didn't give them anything personal." "Thank you." She looked at me sideways. "They already know enough, don't they?" I didn't answer. Martha took another sip. "He lived," she said. I heard. "Good." "Yes." She watched me carefully. "You want to tell me who you used to be?" I almost smiled. "Not really." "That's fair." A small silence passed. Then she added, "But maybe you ought to tell yourself." By noon, I was back at the sink. Work helped, it always did. The body understands labor better than it understands memory. Soap, water, plates, and silverware, things that could be cleaned, things that improved after a little pressure. Around 3, the back door opened. I looked up to see Daniel Mercer's brother standing there. This time, he wasn't alone. The general was with him. Martha stepped between us in the kitchen before I could even speak. "We're closed for private prep," she said. The general gave her a polite nod. "We won't stay long." "That's what people say before staying long," Martha countered. A faint smile touched his face. "I understand." I dried my hands slowly and stepped around the sink. "It's all right," I told her. Martha didn't move right away. Then she stepped aside, but not far. "That was Martha. She gave you space without ever abandoning you." The brother looked exhausted. His eyes were red, but his posture had softened. "He's awake," he said. I felt the words sink in before I truly processed them. "Daniel," he continued. He nodded. He asked what happened. "We told him a woman from the kitchen saved him." I looked down. "Then you told him too much." "No," the general said quietly, "not enough." I met his eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. For one terrible second, I feared it was another letter. It wasn't. It was a photograph. He laid it on the stainless steel prep table between us. I didn't touch it. The photo was old and slightly faded. A younger version of the general stood beside Earl Patterson outside what looked like a motor pool in the desert. Both men were dusty, tired, and grinning with that worn-out exhaustion soldiers show when the worst of the day is behind them. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. Standing between them was a much younger woman in surgical scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face half turned away from the camera. Me. I stared at it, breathless. "I don't remember this," I said. "I know," the general replied. "You weren't meant to. It was taken after the convoy attack. You were attached to the forward surgical team for 3 weeks." The brother looked from the general to me. "You served?" I shook my head slowly. "Civilian trauma contractor, short rotation." It was before the VA. I had almost forgotten the photo existed because I had almost forgotten the woman in it. Asterisk almost. The general tapped the edge of the picture. "Earl kept this." My throat tightened. "He never told me." "He didn't talk much," the general said. "Not about important things." For the first time, his voice shifted, just a little. "He wasn't just a mechanic," he continued. "He was the man who pulled me out of a burning vehicle when I couldn't move. He took shrapnel doing it. Never wrote it up. Never asked for a medal. He said medals were just metal and paperwork." A quiet sadness crossed his face. That was Earl. I looked at the photograph again. The false shape of the past shifted once more. I had assumed the general remembered me because of Daniel, but he remembered me because of Earl, too. Because long before that night at the hospital, all three of us had stood in the same dust under the same harsh sun, doing what needed to be done and pretending it hadn't left a mark on our souls. The general looked at me, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You saved my life in that field hospital," he said. "Then, years later, you tried to save the man who saved mine." No one in the kitchen moved. Even Martha had gone still. I swallowed hard. "That doesn't make me innocent." "No," he said gently, "it makes you human." That nearly broke me. Not the praise, but the mercy woven into it. I turned away and put both hands on the edge of the sink. For years, I had worn guilt like a form of punishment, because punishment at least gave a definitive shape to my loss. But standing there with that photograph on the table, I felt something far more frightening than guilt. I felt the dawning possibility that my story was not as simple as I had constructed it to be. And I didn't know how to live with that. I asked them to leave the photograph on the table. Not because I wanted to look at it, but because I wasn't ready to touch it. The general nodded as if he understood, though I wasn't sure anyone truly could. Daniel's brother glanced at me once before following him toward the back door. Martha watched them leave with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. When the door clicked shut, the kitchen seemed to settle back into its rhythm. The hum of the refrigerator returned, a pot rattled on the stove, and somewhere in the dining room, a chair scraped against the floor. Ordinary sounds. Merciful sounds. Martha stepped closer to the table and looked down at the photograph. "Well," she said quietly, "that explains your knife skills." I let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh, but stopped short. She didn't smile, and neither did I. We just stood there for a while, two women past the age of pretending that silence always needed to be fixed. Then she said, "You planning to run again?" I looked at her. "Again? Don't act like you haven't been running since the day I hired you." I wanted to deny it, but Martha was not a woman you lied to if you respected her. "I didn't know what else to do," I said. She nodded once. "That's different from not having a choice." The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked back at the photograph. My younger face stared back from the past, half-turned, utterly unaware of everything that was to come. I hardly recognized her. Not because she looked different, but because she still believed that usefulness and worth were the same thing. "I made the call," I said. "I know." "No, Martha, you don't." My voice sharpened before I could soften it. "People keep trying to turn it into something noble. It wasn't. I stood there with 2 lives in front of me, and I chose. One man lived, one man died. That is not poetry. That is not redemption. That is blood math." Martha didn't flinch. "No," she said, "it's not poetry." I waited. She picked up a towel and folded it slowly, carefully, as if giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the weight of it. "But I've run this place long enough to know something about choosing," she continued. "When there isn't enough money to pay every bill, you pick one. When two workers need hours and the register can only carry one of them, you pick one. Smaller stakes, sure. But the feeling is the same. Somebody always pays. I looked away. That doesn't make it right. No, she said, but it makes it real. That was Martha's way. No comfort she didn't believe in, no easy forgiveness, just the truth, laid out plain and unadorned. I went back to the sink. The lunch rush came in heavy and strange. Everyone had heard snippets of rumors by then, though no one seemed to know exactly what had happened. Rumors travel faster than food in a restaurant. By 2 o'clock, a server was whispering that I had been a battlefield surgeon. By 3 o'clock, another claimed I had operated on a senator in Iraq. By 4 o'clock, someone insisted I had been framed by the government, which would have been almost comical if any part of this felt funny at all. I kept my head down. Scrubbed pans. Rinsed glasses. Stacked plates. Around 5 o'clock, Martha walked over holding the office phone. For you. I dried my hands. Who is it? Hospital. My first instinct was to say no. My second instinct was worse, it was to listen. I took the phone. Hello. A woman's voice came through, professional but cautious. Is this Eleanor Hart? I hadn't heard my full name spoken in that tone for years. Yes. This is Claire Benton, patient advocate at St. Anselm Medical Center. Mr. Daniel Mercer has asked to speak with you. I closed my eyes. I'm not family. He knows. I'm not his doctor. He knows that, too. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, the woman added, softer, he said he won't ask again. It was unfair. Or maybe it wasn't. I opened my eyes. When? Tonight, if possible. I looked across the kitchen. Martha stood near the stove, pretending not to listen while hanging on to every word. I'll be there as soon as my shift ends, I said. After I hung up, Martha gestured toward the door with a sharp flick of her hand. Go now. I still have 2 hours on the clock. And I have 6 staff members who are more than capable of scrubbing dishes poorly until closing time. Martha, don't make me fire you just to get you out the door, she insisted. So I went. The hospital room was cloaked in shadows when I arrived. Daniel Mercer lay propped up against his pillows, his frame pale and crisscrossed by the shadows of medical tubing, though he appeared far less fragile than I had anticipated. His brother remained seated in the chair by the window, his presence heavy with intent. The general rose as I entered. Daniel turned his head slowly, and for a long moment, neither of us said a word. Then he whispered, "You look different." I almost offered a smile. "You do, too." His lips curled as if he wanted to laugh, but he lacked the stamina to follow through. "They told me you were the one who saved me," he said. "I did what I could until the paramedics arrived." That sounds like the kind of dismissive answer people give when they are uncomfortable with gratitude. "It's simply the truth," I replied. He studied me with an intensity that felt like a weight. "I remember you," he said. That caught me off guard. "From the VA?" He gave a faint nod. "In flashes. Voices mostly. Your voice was the only one that remained calm." I looked down at my hands, suddenly self-conscious. He took a slow, labored breath. "My father told me about that night years ago. He didn't tell me everything, though." "He told you enough." The general's jaw tightened, but he refrained from interrupting. Daniel continued, "I spent such a long time harboring anger toward you." "I know." "No, you don't," he countered. "You're right," I said quietly. "I suppose I don't." His gaze drifted toward the ceiling, tracing the sterile pattern of the tiles. "For years, I assumed you had decided that my life was worth more than the others." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. There it was, the ugly core of the wound. I looked at him directly. "I never thought that." "I know that now," he acknowledged. "No," I insisted softly. "You need to hear me say it. I didn't choose you because of your status, your father's influence, or what your future might hold. I chose based on what I believed gave both patients the best chance of survival under impossible conditions. And I was wrong about part of it." His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though his voice remained steady. "Which part?" he asked. "I thought I could carry the burden alone." The general looked away, his composure fraying. Daniel swallowed hard. "My brother is determined to sue the hospital," he said. I glanced toward the window. The brother offered no denial. That is your prerogative, I said. We need your testimony. There it was, the hidden motive, or at least one of them. I felt a familiar, cold dread rise within me, not a fear of legal repercussions or even shame, but a profound dread of being dragged back into rooms where language is weaponized and the truth is bent by whoever holds the most power. Daniel watched me, his gaze analytical. I won't ask you to ruin your life a second time, he promised. You might not have to ask, I replied. The general stepped forward. Eleanor. I turned to him. You have already paid more than your fair share of this debt. That should have been a comfort, but instead, it kindled a cold fire in my chest. My share, I repeated. Earl died. Daniel lived with a guilt that was never his to bear. Your family sheltered a lie to protect your name. The hospital sacrificed me to preserve its reputation. And I retreated to a kitchen because hiding was easier than standing in the light and admitting that I did my best, and that my best was not enough. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. I turned back to Daniel. I will testify, I said. His brother straightened up. But not for the sake of revenge, I added. The room seemed to hold its breath. I won't help you transform Earl into a political weapon. I won't let you paint me as a martyr. And I won't pretend that the past becomes pristine just because a courtroom finally deigns to hear it. Daniel gave a slow, deliberate nod. What do you want then? I looked at the monitors beside his bed, the rhythmic lines, the fragile proof that life was still flickering on. I want the truth recorded somewhere it cannot be buried again. For the first time, the general's expression shifted. It wasn't shock, nor was it pride. It was something quieter, a profound relief, or perhaps grief finally being allowed to rest. That night, as I left the hospital, the air felt sharper, colder than it had before. I walked to my car slowly, hyper-aware of the space I occupied. I had spent years convincing myself that my silence was a form of penance. Now, I was beginning to realize it had merely been a refuge. Stepping out of that sanctuary would have a cost. Perhaps more than I was prepared to pay. But some debts do not ask if you are ready to settle them, they simply come due. The hearing was not held in a courtroom, which surprised many. Daniel's brother had anticipated a spectacle: lawyers, reporters, a gallery of strangers waiting for a collapse. Instead, the hospital's legal team insisted on an internal review panel, 3 physicians, 1 administrator, and an outside observer. It was quiet, controlled, and recorded, but shielded from the public eye. Part of me felt a flicker of relief. The other part understood exactly why they preferred it this way. Truth is far more manageable when the audience is kept to a minimum. I wore the same jacket I had worn to work for the last 2 years. Nothing formal, no grand statement. Just something that felt like me. The room was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps my memory had simply amplified the past to match the scale of my guilt. There had been so many rooms back then: conference tables, humming fluorescent lights, chairs arranged for decisions that nobody wanted to claim. Daniel sat at the far end, pale but upright. His brother stood beside him, and the general remained near the wall, hands clasped behind his back, a silent sentinel. When I walked in, there was no announcement. I simply took the empty seat across from the panel. Miss Hart, the administrator, began with a tone that was polite yet decidedly distant. She offered a cursory thanks for my attendance. I nodded. We would like to review the events of. I know exactly what you'd like, I interrupted gently. Let's not waste time pretending this is about mere clarification. A flicker of unease passed across her face. One of the physicians, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, leaned forward. Then tell us what you believe this is about, he said. I held his gaze. Responsibility, I said, and what we are willing to admit about how it is assigned. Silence followed, not an uncomfortable one, but an honest one. They asked their questions, and I answered them, not with defensiveness, not with emotion, but with plain, stark facts. 2 patients, finite resources, 1 singular choice. They attempted to circle back to protocol, to the guidelines that make brutal decisions look structured on paper. I didn't argue against the framework. I pointed out where it had shattered. You had a triage system, I said. It prioritized survival rates. It favored those with fewer complications. It also, quite unofficially, favored the patients whose outcomes were deemed more valuable to the hospital's reputation. The administrator shifted uncomfortably. That is an unfair characterization. No, I replied. It is an incomplete one, but it is not unfair. I glanced at Daniel. At the time, I believed that adhering to the system would lead to one certain death. I thought breaking from it might save both. I was wrong. The gray-haired physician spoke again. Knowing what you know now, if you were in that same room, facing that same question, what would you do? I did not hesitate. I would make the same call. Daniel's brother drew a sharp breath. The administrator looked almost satisfied, as if my answer confirmed a narrative he was eager to seal. But the physician didn't let it go. Explain, he commanded. I nodded. Because the decision was never about choosing one life over another. It was about refusing to let a flawed system decide without a challenge. I believed there was a path that gave both men a chance. I took it, and I failed one of them. That failure belongs to me. But so does the refusal to accept that the outcome was predetermined by policy. The outside observer, a woman who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. Why didn't you say this before? That was the question that mattered. I thought about it for a long beat. Because I didn't think it would change anything, I started, then shook my head. That's not entirely true. It would have changed how the hospital defended itself. It would have exposed the decisions made above my pay grade. It would have brought a larger, systemic problem into the light. I chose not to do that. Why? She asked. I looked down at my hands, then back up at her. Because I was tired, I confessed. And because I believed that protecting the system might protect future patients more than dismantling it would. The room absorbed the weight of those words. No agreement, no condemnation, just recognition. They brought up Earl Patterson's letter. I hadn't expected it. The administrator slid a copy across the table. We recovered this from Mr. Patterson's records. It appears he expressed a clear preference regarding treatment prioritization. I didn't reach for it. I've read it, I said. And yet you omitted it from your initial report. Why? Does a patient's willingness to sacrifice himself not remove the burden of the physician's duty to try? No, I said. A patient's nobility does not absolve the physician of the responsibility to fight. That earned a few faint, thoughtful nods. When the questions finally ceased, the room fell into a heavy stillness. The administrator folded his hands. The panel will deliberate and issue a statement, he said. I stood up. I didn't come here for your statement, I replied. He blinked, stunned. Then why are you here? I looked at Daniel. For him, I said. And for the record. The outside observer asked, what do you want the record to reflect? I took a steadying breath. That the system failed 2 patients that night, not just one. That accountability was narrowed down to a single decision because it was easier than examining the structure that created the crisis. And that sometimes, doing the right thing does not prevent harm, it simply shifts the burden of who carries it. No one wrote that down immediately, but I knew it was etched into the transcript. Afterward, there were no dramatic exits. People stood, shuffled papers, and gathered their belongings. Daniel approached me slowly. You didn't clear your name, he observed. That wasn't the goal. They're still going to say you were wrong. I was wrong, I said. He studied me. Not in the way they mean. I had no answer for that. His brother stepped forward. We are not filing the lawsuit, he said. I was surprised. Why? He glanced at Daniel. Because this isn't the kind of thing a settlement can fix. He was right. It wasn't. The general waited until the room had cleared. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. You gave him his life back, he said. I shook my head. I gave him time. What he does with it is his own. He nodded. That is more than most people ever get. We walked out together. Not as allies, not as friends, but something in between, 2 people caught in the aftermath of the same storm. A week later, I returned to work. The same sink, the same rhythm, the same plates. Nothing about the kitchen had changed, but I had. It was a shift that no one else could see. Around mid-morning, Martha handed me an envelope. No return address, she said. Inside was a short and signed note, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. *, you did what I could never ask you to do. I knew who it was from. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, along with the uncashed check. Money cannot settle debts of this magnitude. That evening, after we closed, I stayed behind. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I stood at the sink, my hands resting on the cool steel, watching my reflection. For years, I had seen only what I had lost: the title, the career, the version of myself that moved through the world with absolute certainty. Now, I saw something else. It wasn't redemption, nor was it forgiveness, it was continuity. A life that hadn't ended when everything else fell apart. It was a life that had simply changed its shape and, perhaps, in some measure, grown a little more honest. If you have listened this far, I won't tell you how to judge what I did. I won't ask you to decide whether I was right or wrong. Life does not divide itself into such clean categories, no matter how desperately we want it to. But I will say this: there are moments when you will not have enough information, enough time, or enough certainty to make a perfect choice. And yet, you will have to choose anyway. When that moment arrives, I hope you choose with all the care you can carry, and that you find a way to live with the cost of that choice afterward. If this story resonated with you, or brought to mind a moment you have had to carry, please know that you are not alone. Thank you for listening. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, quiet, complicated, and deeply human, you are always welcome here.